Good evening, and thank you for coming. Welcome to Trinity Presbyterian Church. I am co-pastor here, Tim Coombs, along with my wife, who's my fellow co-pastor, Kathy Gorman Coombs. And we're so glad to share with you Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, as told by my son, Keith Coombs. The performance will take about an hour, and there's no intermission. So I invite you to sit back, think 200 years ago or so, downstate New York, where things were simpler time, a beautiful, serene setting. And now I present to you my son, Keith Coombs.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening. I'm really excited to do this for you. I want to lead off very quickly and say that I'm dedicating this performance to a couple of people. Earlier this year, we lost my grandparents very close to each other, and just in memory of them, but also most especially in memory of my late high school director and community theater director. She was also a great mentor and friend, Deborah May. So, Chief, Grandma, Pop, I hope you enjoy. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, there lies the small market town, or rural port, which by some is known as Greensburg, but is more widely and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name is given in former days, we are told, by the good housewives of the adjacent country for the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but I merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this town, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a small valley, or rather a lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is perhaps the only sound to ever break through among the uniform tranquility. From the listless repose of this place and the peculiar nature of its inhabitants, who are descended from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are known as the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to pervade the very air and hang in the atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the land was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place continues under the sway of some witching influence. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs and superstitions. Well, they see sights and hear voices and music in the air. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the sky than in any other parts of the country. The neighborhood abounds with haunted tales, twilight spots, and local superstitions. And the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. The dominant spirit, that seems to be commander-in-chief of the very powers of the air and haunts this enchanted region, is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head was carried away by a cannonball during the Revolutionary War. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent country roads and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Local beliefs allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, that the specter rides forth in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he travels along the hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary figure, which has furnished many a wild tale in that region of shadow. And the nightmare is known at all country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch communities, embosomed here and there in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and change which is sweeping by the rest of this country, it sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, undisturbed by the rushing currents. Though many years have lapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I wonder whether I should not still find the same families and the same trees vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, there was a worthy wight by the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the forest, as well as for the mind, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane, well, it was not inapplicable to his appearance. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders and long arms and legs. His feet, well, they might have served for shovels, and his hands dangled a mile out of his sleeves, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears and large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose that, well, perched upon his spindle neck, made him appear as though he were a weathercock to tell which way the wind would blow. To see his profile striding along a windy hill with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descended upon the earth, or of some scarecrow eloped from his cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building, rudely constructed of logs, and one large room. The windows were partly glazed and partly patched by the leaves of old copybooks, and it was secured at vacant hours, most ingeniously, by a withe twisted in the handle of the door, with stakes set against the window shutters, so that, well, though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would have some embarrassment in getting out. An idea most probably borrowed by the architect, Joost van Houten, from the mystery of an eel pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation at the foot of a woody hill, with a small brook running close by, with a large formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices could be heard on a drowsy summer's day, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master in a tone of menace, or peradventure by the appalling sound of the birch as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind that golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. I would not have it imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who joy at the smart of his victims. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Why, your mere puny stripling who winced at the slightest flourish of the rod was passed by with indulgence. But the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some tough-headed, broad-skirted little Dutch urchin who sulked and swelled and grew dogged beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents. And he never inflicted a chastisement without following it with the assurance that they would remember it and thank him for it the longest day they had to live. When school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of some of the larger children, and on holiday afternoons would accompany some of the smaller ones home who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives noted for comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good standing with his pupils, for the revenue arising from his schoolhouse was small, and would have scarcely been enough to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder. And though lank, he had the dilating powers of an anaconda. So, to help out his maintenance, he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged with the families of whose children he instructed. With this, he lived successfully a week at a time, with all of his belongings tied up in a little cotton handkerchief. Among his other vocations, he was also the singing master of the vicinity. It was of no small bit of vanity to him to take up his stage at the center of the church gallery, where in his own mind he completely carried the palm from the parson. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above the rest. Thus, by diverse little makeshifts, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought by all who understood nothing of the labor of head work to have a wonderfully easy life of it. From his half-itinerant life, too, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip with him from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. It was of no small bit of pride to him that he was found in the smiles of all the country damsels. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, which, by the way, he most firmly and potently believed. When school was dismissed, it was often his pleasure to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover which bordered his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales until the printed page became a mere mist before his eyes in the setting sun. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be domiciliated, every witching sound of nature at that time would startle an already excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill, the boding cry of the tree toad, the hooting of the screech owl all startled his imagination. The fireflies, too, should one of uncommon brightness come streaming across his path, well, it was just about enough to send the poor varlet skyward. And should some blockhead of a beetle come blundering up against the side of his head, well, the poor varlet was ready to give up the ghost with the thought that he had been struck by a witch's token. His only resource on such occasion, whether to drown thought or raise spirits, was to sing psalm tunes to himself. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his sweet nasal melody in linked sweetness, long drawn out. Another of his fearful pleasures was to sit with the old Dutch wives as they sat by the fire spinning, with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and there listen to their tales of ghosts and goblins and haunted fields and haunted brooks and haunted trees and haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman, or galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes referred to him. But if there was a pleasure in all of this, while snugly cuddling in a warm chimney corner that was all of a ruddy glow, and where, of course, no specter would dare show its face, it was dearly purchased by his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows would beset his path on a dim, snowy night? How often did he shrink away from some shrub sheeted with snow, that he thought it was a specter before his path? And how often did he cringe at the sound of his own frosty footsteps on the crust beneath his feet? And how often did he fall into complete terror by the sound of a rushing blast through the trees, with the thought that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings? All these, of course, were terrors of the night, phantoms that walk in darkness, and though he had been more than once beset by Satan in diverse shapes, yet daylight put an end to all of this. And he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in spite of the devil in all his works, had his path not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the entire race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the disciples to gather one evening for his instruction in psalmody was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only heiress of a substantial Dutch farmer. Well, she was a blooming lass, a fresh 18, plump as a partridge, bright, melting, and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's prized peaches. She was famed not merely for her beauty, but also for her vast expectations, and was withal of a coquette, as might have been perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, so as best suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold, handed down through her family from the old country, and withal a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in all the country round. Ichabod had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is no surprise that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eye. Moreover, after he visited her at her paternal estate, old Baltus Van Tassel was a thriving, liberal-hearted soul. He seldom, it is true, set either his thoughts or his sights beyond the limits of his own farm, but within those, everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, though not proud on it, and piqued himself on the hearty abundance rather than the style with which he lived. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon Van Tassel's sumptuous array of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in its belly and an apple in its mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed with a coverlet of crust. The ducks were paired cozily together like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce. The porkers, he saw the future, sleek, dyed of bacon, and juicy, relishing ham. And not a turkey he beheld, but daintily trussed up with a gizzard under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages. Beyond those, Ichabod took in the sights of the rich, fat meadowlands and orchards burdened with ruddy fruit and grains and Indian corn that all surrounded the warm tenements of Van Tassel. From the moment Ichabod saw these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this venture, however, he had more to contend with than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but enchanters, fire-breathing dragons, and giants, and other easily conquered foes to contend with, and had to make his way merely through gates of iron and brass, and over walls of adamant to the castle keep, where the lady of his heart was confined, all which he achieved as easily as a man would carve his way through the center of a Christmas pie. And then the lady would give him her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, however, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, and had to contend with admirers of real flesh and blood that beset every pathway to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in the common cause should any newcomer arise. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade by the name of Abraham, or, according to the Dutch abbreviation, Bram van Brunt, the hero of the country round, known for his great feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short black curly hair and a bluff, but not unpleasant countenance. From his great Herculean frame and powers of limb, he had earned the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was known for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was foremost at all races and cockfights, and was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and making a decision that showed of no favoritism or gainsay with the other. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but he had more mischief than ill will in his composition. And at bottom, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor. The common people revered him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill. And when any madcapped prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, well, they simply shook their heads and said, Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This rantipole hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries. And though his gentle caresses and endearments were something like those of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his advances were signal for other rivals to retire, having no interest to cross a lion in his amours, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to the palings of Van Tassel on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was within, courting, or, as it is termed, sparking within, all other suitors turned away and carried the war into other quarters. Such was the formidable candidate with whom Ichabod had to contend with. And a stronger man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a braver man would have despaired, but Ichabod had a strong mixture of pliability and perseverance, yielding but tough, like a supplejack. Though he bent beneath the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, jerk! He carried himself as erect and held his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours, any more than that stormy lover Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under the cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Old Baltus Van Tassel loved his daughter even better than his pipe, and like a good man, an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. Thus, while honest Balt sat at one end of the piazza smoking his evening pipe, Ichabod carried suit with the daughter, sauntering along in the twilight, that hour most favorable to the lover's eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. Why, to me, they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have but 1,000 avenues of access, while others have but a single point. It is a great triumph of skill to maintain possession of the former, but a still greater proof of generalship to maintain the latter, for man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is indeed entitled to some renown. But he who holds undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. This was not the case, evidently, with the redoubtable Brom Bones. For the moment Ichabod made his advances known, the interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings of Van Tassel on a Sunday night, and a deadly feud gradually arose between he and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rustic chivalry in his nature, would have fain carried matters to open warfare and settled their pretensions to the lady thus by single combat, but Ichabod was too wary of the superior might of his adversary, and had overheard the boast of Bones that he would double that schoolmaster up and lay him on the shelf of his own schoolhouse, and was too conscious to give him an opportunity. He left Brom no alternative but to draw on his funds of rustic waggery and play off boorish practical jokes on the schoolmaster. He harried his otherwise peaceful domain, smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, and broke into the schoolhouse at night despite its formidable fastenings of withe and window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor varlet began to think that all the witches of the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all manner of turning him into ridicule in the presence of their mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous fashion, and introduced him as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way, matters continued for some time without producing any material effect on the relative situation. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod sat enthroned upon the lofty stool from which he usually looked over his little literary realm, when suddenly the quiet study of his pupils was interrupted by a messenger with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merrymaking or quilting frolic, to be held that evening at the castle of Mynheer Van Tassel. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The students were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, but those who were tardy, well, they had a smart application to help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put back on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned. Benches were thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before its usual time. Ichabod now spent at least that extra hour in his toilet, brushing up his best, and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranged his locks by a broken piece of looking-glass that hung up in the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before the mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the Dutch farmer with whom he was domiciliated, the choleric old Hans van Ripper, and thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight errant in quest of adventure. It is meet that I should, in the true style of romantic story, give some description as to the appearance of my hero and his steed. The creature he rode was a broken-down old plow horse that had outlived everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a ewe neck and head like a hammer. Its mane was knotted and covered in burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, we must assume he had fire and metal in his day, if we may assume by the name he bore of gunpowder. Ichabod was a suitable rider for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups that brought his knees nearly up to the pommel, His elbows stuck out like those of a grasshopper, and he carried the whip perpendicular in his hand like a scepter. And as he jogged along, the flapping of his arms was not unlike that of a pair of wings. He wore a small wool cap which rested on the bridge of his nose, or so the scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the tails of his coat fluttered out behind him, almost to the end of the horses. Thus was the appearance of Ichabod Crane as he issued forth from the gate of Hans von Ripper. As I have mentioned, it was that jolly time of autumn, and as Ichabod jogged slowly along the banks of the Hudson, he was surrounded by the culinary symptoms of that happy time of year. All around him, he saw the vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence in the trees, others piled up on the ground for the cider press, and some heaped up in baskets for the marketplace. And beyond that, he saw the rich fields of Indian corn with their yellow ears peeking out from their green coverts. And beneath that, he saw the great pumpkin with its yellow belly turned towards the sun, all hinting at the promise of luxurious pies, hasty puddings, and cakes, all prepared by the delicate, dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. It was towards evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Ir Van Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country, the old Dutch farmers, a spare and leathern-faced race, in homespun clothes and handmade ornaments. The daughters were almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or white frock gave symptom to city innovation. The sons were in their short-skirted coats with stupendous brass buttons and their large shoes. And Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the occasion on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mischief and mayhem in which nobody but he could manage. He was noted for preferring wild, unbroken horses, for he beheld tractable, well-behaved steeds as unworthy of a lad of spirit. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the parlor of Van Tassel. Not the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious displays of red and white, but the luxurious display of a genuine Dutch tea table in that jolly time of autumn. Such heaped up dainties known only to the most experienced Dutch wives. Well, there was the doughty donut, the tender olykoek, the crisp and crumbling cruller, and then there were sweet cakes and shortcakes and honey cakes and ginger cakes and a whole family of cakes, and then there were peach pies and apple pies and pumpkin pies, and then there was sliced beef and smoked ham and bowls and dishes of preserved plums and quinces and pears and roasted chicken, broiled shad, and right beside it was bowls of milk and cream mingled together, all higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I have enumerated them. Heaven bless the mark. I want breath and time to describe this bounty as it deserves, but I am too eager to get on with my tale. Fortunately, Ichabod was in no such hurry, but did ample service to sample every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature, whose spirits rose with eating, well, as some men's do with drink. Well, he could not help, too, chuckling to himself as he ate and rolled his great green eyes around him, how he might one day be lord of all this almost undescribable luxury and splendor. Then he thought how soon he'd turn his back on the old schoolhouse and snap his fingers in the face of Hans von Ripper or any other itinerant pedagogue that would dare call him comrade. Then the sound of music summoned to the common room or hall. The orchestra was an old gray-haired man who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. The instrument he played was as old and battered as himself, and the better part of the time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a bow of the head, only to stomp his foot when a new couple was to start. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Why, to have seen him strutting about, one might have thought that Saint Vitus, that patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. How, then, could the flogger of urchins be otherwise amorous and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously at all of his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in a corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of some of the sager folk, who, with old Van Tassel, gossiped over former times and long drawn-out tales about the war. But in time, all the tales ultimately turned to that favorite subject of Sleepy Hollow. The tales of ghosts and goblins. Tales were told of mourning cries, wailings, and funeral trains that were heard about the tree famous with Major Andre. Tales were also told of the woman in white who was known to haunt Raven Rock and can be heard crying out on snowy nights, having perished in a blizzard herself. But ultimately, the tales turned to that favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who was known to be heard several times of late and was known to tie his horse to the gravestones at the churchyard. The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever of ghosts and goblins, how he met this midnight rider on returning from his recent foray into Sleepy Hollow, how they galloped together over bush and brake and swamp and stream until they reached the church bridge, when the Hessian turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into a brook, and disappeared over the treetops in a flash of fire and brimstone. This tale was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous tale by Brom Bones, who made light of the Headless Horseman as an errant jockey. Well, he affirmed that on returning from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, that he had been overtaken by the Midnight Companion, that he challenged him to a bowl of punch and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat that goblin horse all hollow. But just as they reached the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and disappeared in a clap of thunder. All these tales, told in that way which men speak in the dark, the listeners only now and then responding with a gleam of the pipe, now sank deep into the mind of Ichabod Crane. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families and could be heard for some time clattering over the hollow roads and into the distant hills. Ichabod alone lingered behind, hoping, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, believing that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview, I cannot say, for in fact I do not know, but something, I fear, must have gone wrong. For he certainly carried forth after no great interval with the air of a man quite full of despair and crestfallen. Oh, these women! These women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Were her advances of the pedagogue all a sham to secure the conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Suffice to say, he stole forth with the energy of one who was sacking a hen roost rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the left or right at the scenes of rural wealth which he'd so often gloated, he made his way directly to the stable where, with several hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most uncourteously. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, began his pursuit homewards over the rolling hills that rise above Tarrytown, in which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. He had never felt more lonely and dismal. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the watchdog barking from the opposite shore of the Hudson. But it was so vague and faint that it only gave an idea of the distance between he and the faithful companion of man. No signs of life occurred around him, except the occasional melancholy chirp of a cricket or twang of a bullfrog. All the tales of ghosts and goblins which he'd heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars sank deeper into the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He was, moreover, approaching the very scene where many of the stories had been laid. At the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree. It towered like a giant among the rest. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, wide enough that they could have served for trunks of regular trees. They twisted down almost to the earth, only to rise back up into the air. It was tied with the tragic tale of Andre, who had been captured hard by and has ever since been known as Major Andre's tree. The common people revere it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly due to the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly due to the woeful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle to himself, but he thought his whistling was answered. But assumed it must be but a blast blowing sharply through the dry branches. But then he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. As he approached a little nearer and peered closer, it must have been where some lightning had struck the tree and the white wood was left bare. But then he heard a moan. His teeth chattered, his knees smote against the sides of the saddle, for it was but one bough rubbing against another in the breeze. Ichabod passed the fearful tree in safety, but new perils now lay before him. About 200 yards beyond the tree, there is a small brook that runs into a marshy glen known as Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side serve as a kind of bridge over it. To cross this bridge would be the severest trial, for it was at this identical location that the unfortunate Major Andre was captured, and has ever since been known as a haunted stream, and fearful is the schoolboy who must cross it alone after dark. His heart began to thump, but summoning up all his courage, he gave his horse half a score of kicks and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. The perverse old animal began, it is true, but it was only to make a lateral move, and he ran broadside into a fence. Ichabod, whose fears rose with the delay, jerked the reins in the opposite direction, but the horse began, but only to plunge to the opposite side of the road, where he ran into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The troubled pedagogue now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starling ribs of Gunpowder, who dashed forward with a suddenness only to come to an equal stop just at the foot of the bridge that nearly sent his rider sprawling. Just at that moment, a plashy tramp caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. From the dark shadow of the grove at the foot of the bridge emerged a figure, towering, misshapen, and massive. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom of the darkness, like some monster ready to spring upon the traveler. What was to be done? The hair of the affrighted pedagogue stood on end. To turn and fly now surely was too late, if it were ghost or goblin which could ride on the very wings of the wind. Summoning up, therefore, in a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demands in still more agitated accents. "Sir, I demand to know, who are you?" Still, he received no reply. Once more he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder and broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. But at that very moment, the shadowy figure of alarm put itself into motion and stood at once at the center of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the figure might now be ascertained. It appeared to be a horseman of towering proportions, shrouded in a cloak, riding a steed of a powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on the blind side of old Gunpowder as they jogged. Ichabod, who had no relish for this midnight companion, and thought to himself the adventures of Brom Bones and the Galloping Hessian, quickened his steed in hopes of leaving the traveler behind, but the stranger quickened his to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, hoping to lag behind and let the stranger pass. But the other did the same. His heart sank within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. On mounting a rising ground which brought the figure in relief against the night sky, Ichabod was horror-struck on discovering that the rider was indeed headless. But his fears rose even greater still when he discovered that the head, which should have rested on the shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His fears rose to desperation, and he rained a shower of kicks on old Gunpowder, hoping by sudden movement to give his rider the slip. But the specter started full jump with him. Away then they dashed over swamp and stream, thick and thin, stones flying, sparks flashing. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered out behind him as he stretched over the neck of Gunpowder in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the part of the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed by a demon rather than keeping up it, made a lateral move and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow for about 1/4 mile, shaded by trees when it reaches the bridge, famous in tale, and just beyond stands the church. The panic of his steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase. But just as he reached halfway through the hollow, he felt the girths of the saddle start to give way, and he endeavored to seize it firm by holding it at the pommel, but it was too late, and he had just time to save himself by grasping Gunpowder around the neck when he felt the saddle fall to the earth behind and was closely trampled underfoot. For a moment, the terror of Hans von Ripper's wrath passed through his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was on his haunches, and unskillful rider as he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on the other side, and sometimes vaulted on the high ridge of the horse's back with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. A parting in the trees now cheered him with the thought that the bridge was not far away. A silver star in the bosom of the brook cheered him with the thought that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring through the trees. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. But at that moment, he heard the panting and blowing of the horse close behind him, and even fancied he felt his hot breath. Once more, he cudgeled the sides of Gunpowder. He made the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks and gained the opposite side of the bridge, only now casting a look behind to see if the goblin should disappear according to rule in a flash of fire and brimstone. But at that very moment, he saw the goblin steed rising in his stirrups and in the very act hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash, sending him headlong into the dust. And the steed, the horseman, and Gunpowder passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, soberly cropping the grass of Van Ripper's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but still no Ichabod. The children gathered at the schoolhouse, but they strolled idly along the brook, for there was no schoolmaster. Hans von Ripper began to feel some uneasiness as to the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set out on foot, and after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. At the broad part of the road leading up to the bridge was found the saddle, deeply dented and trampled in the dirt, as if ridden over at furious pace. and just to the other side of the bridge was found the hat of the poor pedagogue, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the pedagogue was not to be discovered. Hans von Ripper, as chief executor of his estate, examined the small cotton bundle which held all his worldly effects. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, well, they belonged to the community, excepting for Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, a New England Almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which last was a sheet of foolscap, scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts at making a copy of verses in honor of the heiress. These poetic books and poetic scrawl were henceforth consigned to the flame by Hans von Ripper, who determined never again to send his children to school, believing that he never knew of any good come from the same reading and writing. The schoolhouse was moved to another part of the hollow, and a new pedagogue reigned in his stead. The curious event caused much speculation on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips gathered where the saddle was found, the hat, the pumpkin, and at the gravestones at the churchyard. The tales of Brower and Bones were called to mind with a whole budget of others, and when they had compared them with the symptoms of the current case, well, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion Ichabod had been carried away by the Galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody bothered to say any more about him. It is true that an old farmer returned from a visit down to New York several years later and brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had fled the neighborhood partly in terror and fear of the Galloping Hessian and Hans von Ripper, and partly due to mortification at being dismissed by the heiress. That he had kept up school, moved his quarters to a distant part of the country, studied law, been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, wrote for the newspaper, and finally been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, and always looked exceedingly knowing when the story of Ichabod Crane was related, and always broke into a hearty laugh whenever the pumpkin was brought up, which made some believe he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old Dutch wives, however, who are the best judges in these matters, affirm to this day that Ichabod Crane was spirited away by supernatural means. The bridge, more than ever, became an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years so as to approach the church from the border of the mill pond. The abandoned schoolhouse soon fell into decay and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of Ichabod Crane. And the schoolboy, loitering homeward on a drowsy summer evening, can often fancy his voice singing a sweet, melancholy psalm tune over the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. Thus concludes the legend of Sleepy Hollow. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me this evening, and to those of you that are watching at home, thank you so much. This has been an incredibly stressful and difficult year for everyone, and I do hope that my story has brought some joy to your evening. So to everyone I say, have a wonderful Halloween, and to those who observe it, a very blessed Samhain. Please, thank you. Have a good night.